Okay, so in the last video, we thought through some of the important connections and concepts that set the foundation for growth. Now we're going to start to put it into action. In this video, we're going to run through some examples of how to map core processes and prioritize them. In the next video, we'll look at how to set up systems to pull data on the key processes so we know clearly how we're growing. These two pieces are critical to command growth. Know how things work, have solid measurement systems in place. In the last video, we'll walk through some implementation tactics. What do you do once you have the foundation built? How do you start to make plans to increase growth? That'll be in the final video. If you haven't yet, head over to jasonunlock.com to download the executive playbook so you can follow along, and subscribe if you haven't already so you can be alerted when new videos are published. So now, let's get straight into some examples using a template provided in the workbook. We're going to continue over our examples from the last video, mapping out some core processes for Apple and Walmart. Okay, so here's the first form we're going to go through. This form is included in the executive playbook, but I've changed the formatting a little bit here, as you can see. I loaded it into an Excel file to make it easier to change, add information, etc. This Excel file will also be provided when you go to jasonunlock.com and download the executive playbook. You'll get this file as well so that you can also easily enter your information and change it as needed. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about before we get started here is just a little bit about area of responsibility. So if you're a CEO, you should probably be looking at the entire company in regards to core processes, inputs, outputs, and how they relate to the unique value proposition. Now, you may not be doing every part of it, but because your responsibility is ultimately the entire company, that's probably the best way for you to look at it. So at least you can have an overall idea and understanding of the company, and this will help you work better with your team. It'll make it more clear for them, and you can kind of hand this off and play an advisory role. If you're not the CEO, then you have some smaller subset of responsibility of the company, and this process still works for that as well. So instead of looking at the entire company, really what you want to do is focus on your specific area. So whether that's sales or accounting or logistics or purchasing, whatever it might be, you want to focus in on those core processes first. But again, we're relating them back to the total company unique value proposition. And that's what we're doing kind of there at the end. But at first, what we want to do is just focus on those core processes, look at the inputs and outputs. You'll get to the same place whether you're the CEO or a vice president or director or all the way down the chain, because everything connects and relates to one another. And that's actually what we'll be doing coming up here in a little bit, is looking at how do these core processes flow throughout the entire company. So in the end, we get to the same place, but we really want to just focus on what it is that we have responsibility for first, and that's what we're doing here. Okay, so in the last video, we talked about Apple and Walmart. We talked about their positioning, their unique value propositions, and how they deliver on those unique value propositions. So if we start with Apple as an example, we had mentioned one of the things was the design that people like, the software system, and really what that relates to is their engineering team that's responsible for that. So I thought a good place to start would be, let's assume that we're in that engineering department and we're trying to look at, okay, how do we deliver on some of these things that lead into our unique value proposition, such as the design, the software, etc. So that's really where I want to start with this is, within that context, let's start looking at some of the core processes that could be. Now, obviously, this is an example, so it may not be perfect. It may be completely wrong to what Apple actually does. That's not really the point. The point is just give you a demonstration of how this could work for a company and how it might work for your company. So that's what we're doing here. Okay, so first, when you're starting this, the way that I do it is you really kind of have to think a little bit general and broad. You might start actually with the outputs. That might be the easiest way to do it, is look at, okay, what are our significant outputs that we're responsible for? And then kind of work backward that way. Or if you already know kind of your processes and that's where you focus, maybe you start there. You probably don't want to start with inputs because that's just, what you need. That usually comes kind of later after you know what it is that you're trying to do. So if we just start with outputs in this example, we'll look at just the design first. We'll keep it pretty simple here. In the end, design, that's one of our engineering outputs. Now, what are the processes that go into that? You could have things like design reviews. That could be a process. Design, engineering design. So I'll just keep it broad and general there, but really that's the whole process of like, okay, we've got a concept where now we're trying to turn it into the actual design of the product. And that leads me to another thing. So you might say, concept design. So now we're developing kind of this concept, and then we're doing the engineering design. We're having design reviews. You might also have like a production release process or something like that. Now, try not to let your mind wander on this because you might already be thinking of other processes or other processes that are needed. And again, we'll do that in the next steps. So for now, you kind of want to just focus on what are the specific things that you're doing. And start, like I'm doing here, kind of just think about it, start putting things down. You can always go back and refine it and change it later. One other thing, so we're going to rank these at the end. So don't focus on priority right now. Just kind of try to get everything out that you can think of, okay? So now in regards to, let's just see, what we've got on inputs on some of these. Okay, so let's look at engineering design. So, you really want to think of what is the process of this engineering design. So what are you taking? So you're probably taking, concepts. There isn't a lot of like physical things in this. Like if you were looking more at like product, looking at, okay, what is the actual, the phone, that might look a little bit different because then you'd have, sensors, things like PCBs, other internal components, and then your processes are going to be much more manufacturing related. So it might be, okay, then this step we are loading this process, or you might just look at the entire, a final assembly or some, bigger chunk of it that ultimately gets you to the phone. So you're going to know best how to do this. But again, this is kind of just a way to get on paper, what are the processes that we actually do? What are the inputs to those? What are the outputs? So we're drawing kind of a map here. That's really what we want to do because in later steps, it's going to help us understand what data do we need. After we hone in on what is the most important processes, then we're going to figure out, okay, how do we pull data so we can track that? And then later in the final video, when we talk about implementation, it's going to help again because we're going to know exactly where to go to do the implementation. So if we find that, this process is the most important, we can really increase our UVP and our value. We can come right back to this and say, this is exactly what we need to do that. And here's the data, to track it and show that we're making progress. So that's kind of the overall what we're doing here. Okay, so again, engineering design, you're going to have concepts, computers. That might be something that someone actually needs to do the job, to do the process, specifications, whatever it might be. The point is to just kind of start connecting the dots here. And I'm not going to do an exhaustive list because that would take way too long. So you can kind of see how it goes. Now, this is kind of the most important thing, and how the process relates to UVP. It's probably going to focus on per output. So like, these all relate to design. So how does the design relate to the unique value proposition? Well, in the case of Apple iPhones, it's aesthetically pleasing. Ultimately, it's unique. There's no other, product out there. There are some that are similar, but nothing exactly like it. Lightweight or something like that. These are kind of all the things that, why do people buy iPhones? Why does, and again, we're going deeper. So in relation to the design, how does that contribute to people buying phones? Okay. And hopefully you've got a strong connection here. Okay. If you don't, you might want to, later, you might want to rethink, and this is part of the process as well. you might want to rethink some of these things that you think are important. Maybe they're not as important. If they're not connecting with something, that's valuable to a customer, they probably shouldn't be getting a high priority. And you can take that into account when we go through the ranking. But as you do this, start thinking about some of those things. If you're struggling to come up with how does this relate to our value that we're offering, then that kind of tells you right there that maybe we should be focusing in other areas. Maybe I, as a manager, should be putting my resources in other areas. Or maybe we should be deprioritizing these things and prioritizing other things. Or, maybe we want to change our processes. Maybe this is something that's like, totally not valuable, or it's more busy work. And how do we change that, to make it more valuable? So that's really, again, this is kind of the entire, why we're doing this. And this is what I do when I work with customers and people. I walk them through this process, and we kind of get to, what really matters. And that's important because, we've all been there. We've all lived that. We do a lot of stuff in our day, and probably 90% of it doesn't matter at the end of the day. This is something that I learned, in my work. Looking back throughout a year, there's really only probably 3 things that really mattered in that year that really actually moved the needle. If you're good, it might be 10 or something like that. But for the most part, a lot of what we do, the meetings, the phone calls, whatever, it ends up just, you don't even remember it, even a week later. So that's kind of the whole point of this, is figure out what matters and what doesn't matter. And you can again, this is probably going to relate to every single design output. So you don't really need to redo that for every single one. But again, we're kind of drawing the connection here. Engineering design, the output is a design concept. You could get more granular with this if you wanted to. You could say the concept design output is a design, and then the engineering design uses that. Okay, and then that comes out with another output that feeds into something else. I mean, that's okay. And then in that case, how it relates might be different. But, don't get too much in the weeds. Like, you don't want to be, well, this is like slightly different than that. Like, that's not super useful. You really kind of want to be broadly speaking. But also at the same time, don't try to create such a big umbrella that everything falls into it. Okay, like the point is, separate what's important from what's not important. Okay, and I hope you keep that in mind as you do this. Okay, so that was some examples of Apple and an actual physical product. Let's just move on to Walmart. Okay, so looking at Walmart in the last video, this is kind of what we had laid out for Walmart in regards to them being somewhat of a service, connecting suppliers with customers. I think we all know Walmart, their position. They're kind of on the low end of the market, offering good prices, good selection, but somewhat standardized. You're not getting something that's totally unique. So I think all of us can understand that. But if we look at how are they delivering on this UVP, they've got purchasing, bulk purchasing, that's a pretty big one, logistics and supply. So if we look at, bulk purchasing, and then we'll go down here and just say logistics, and then we'll go down here and say like supply partnerships, just to kick things off. Okay, so bulk purchasing, again, each one of these has a lot of subcategories or sub-processes. And again, if you're at a lower level, like let's say you're managing the purchasing team versus looking at, total procurement for the company or something like that. If you're at the lower level that you get, the more granular you can kind of get with these core processes. The higher up you get, kind of the more general that you need to be, and then you need to kind of dig in with your team. You can use the same process with your team and kind of delegate that to them to figure out, okay, now you guys go do your core processes. There isn't one person. I mean, this is kind of a way to connect everybody. So, okay, within purchasing, what are the processes? So you're going to have like a quoting process. You're going to have like an audit process for suppliers. You're going to have an evaluation process to say, do we want to work with this supplier or not? So those could be, all the things kind of within bulk purchasing. Logistics, definitely like a metrics process to make sure that things are running as they should be. You're going to have like a fulfillment. I probably spelled that wrong. Don't kill me on that. Probably spelled it wrong. Fulfillment process. You're going to have like a pick and ship process. Okay, so these are kind of all the things within some of the general things within logistics. Supply partnerships. You're going to have a contract review process. You know, you're going to have, again, probably an audit process. Maybe it's the same one. Maybe it's different. And that's kind of, let's just keep it at that. So, and again, the output for all these, the output of a quoting process is probably a quote. Input is probably market information, part information, things like that, so that they can actually complete that process. You want to have an understanding of like what are market prices, what is the part actually that we're trying to quote, or the product that we're trying to quote and bring in. Audit, similar thing. You may want logistic information to understand things like on-time delivery, things like that. You may want others. Evaluation of the purchasing. So you may want to look at quality reports. Audit would probably be an audit report. These are a little bit more granular than the last examples. So this is kind of good. So within Apple, it was more broad, but it led directly to the UVP. This one's a little bit more granular. Now I'm not going to go through all of it. Maybe we can do a couple down here. Logistics, metrics, processes, basically information, shipping information, on-time delivery, things like that. Fulfillment process. So this might be, ERP data, MRP data, things like that, would be the inputs. Because you could be looking at something as broad as like, when was a purchase order issued, and when did we get that out the door, things like that, or from the time it got out the door to when it was delivered, things like that. So again, you'll get into these details, but I'm just trying to kind of think of some general things to help you think through it. Pick and ship, scan tool data. So like if you've got a scanning system with barcodes, you're going to want to tap into that to see like, when were things picked. When did they go from station to station? When did they go from, final assembly or packaging to shipping, things like that. So again, you can kind of go through all these, but I think the key thing here is you're going to know the processes fairly well. You're going to be able to figure out the inputs and outputs, but hopefully that's not too hard for you. But where this thing really is going to shine is, again, relating it back to that UVP. A thorough and streamlined quote process, improves pricing. Audit, somewhat similar. Again, great prices, but also, need it now. Process leads to, accurate inventory and fast delivery, things like that. Okay, so again, you kind of want to do your best job to tie it to a UVP here. Shipping information, some of that's basically the same. I mean, that's like, good prices and need it now. When we're looking at evaluation, that might be more of like good selection. So, and probably others as well. That's probably also pricing as well. But good selection, because you can look at, kind of the right fit for our customer base. Okay, and the other thing that this can do is it can help you, with your processes as well. Because if you look at something like your evaluation process and you're like, well, right now we're just looking at, how many suppliers we have or something like that. This gives it meaning. Well, right now we're using it for this, but we should probably be using it for this. That's kind of, the genius behind all this is to say, look at what you're doing now, but then say, okay, how can that be improved? And this is a great way to do that. Okay, so this next figure, this is figure 4 in the executive playbook. And again, it's a different format. So that it's actually usable, but the methodology is the same. Let's kind of go back to an iPhone example, but this time we're going to focus on building the phone. What you could have is, this is again dependent on what's most comfortable for you. You may start in the middle with your process and then work outward from there. So like if you want to say, okay, my specific thing is in my area, we build the actual phone. Okay. And you can use whatever names or whatever makes the most sense for you for that process, how you want to define it. Okay. And then you can start to work upstream and downstream. So what are the inputs that we need for the phone? Well, we need, the parts for the individual phone. Okay. That's the input, but it's also the output of this upstream process. Okay, so if the output is parts, where do the parts come from? How does that work? Well, this is going to be, logistics. This is essentially, they're going to come from the inventory. So this is like, inventory management is largely that kind of process that makes sure that we have the parts to build the phone. Okay, so within inventory management, well, that's going to be like, basically purchasing and, inbound logistics. And you might find that this shifts around. You might need to add on more inputs and outputs than what's here. But again, this is kind of an idea, and that kind of worked, pretty neatly, but it probably, you'll need to change it. So now we're going from like, okay, purchasing, inbound logistics, they're responsible for getting us the parts in the door. Inventory management, okay, they are, and actually there's probably more processes within that, right? So, that's actually more of an output. But in this case, we'll do it just because I don't want to make this too complicated. They're getting parts, inventory management, making sure that we have them where they need to be and ready. Okay, now we're building the phone. Now what happens with that phone? So the output is a phone. What happens with that? Well, it needs to get, packaged and ready to ship. And again, I'm simplifying this because I don't want it to stretch out. What we're trying to do is map this out for the broad company so that you can see the full impact, so that you ensure that all of those actions that you identify later, you can take full advantage of those, because sometimes you might need things from other areas of the company in order to do what you're trying to do, or vice versa. In order to fully capture it, you might need to work with others in your company. So this is an important step. It's not just an activity of understanding. This is a real thing. You kind of have to know the full chain. Okay, and then the final output of that, let's say, is an iPhone ready for sale. Okay, that's the final sale. Then that goes out and customer buys it. Now, why is this important? Okay, so we looked at all these things. This speaks to the readily available position. It speaks to somewhat easy to use. It's not like software related, but just with the brand Apple, easy to use. So we've got things that are packaged really nicely, unique design. It speaks to that. If it's a little bit hard to do this exercise, it's probably a good thing, because that's what's making you think through, is this actually important, or how important is it? And at the end of this, when we rank them, it'll be much easier for you to say yes 100%, or no, we can move that one lower. Again, so kind of summarize what I said here. Why is this entire thing important? Well, this is how we deliver on readily available, high quality, unique design style. We'll throw that in there. Kind of always want to go back to like unique value that this whole thing is providing. Okay, so let's move on to the final part in this phase, which is ranking the core processes. This is figure 5 from the playbook, in a format where we can actually move things around and play with it. Okay, so Walmart, again, everyday low prices. Everybody knows their slogan. Great selection, great prices. Need it now. So with Walmart, the critical things is going to be, the logistics part of it is going to be critical, right? So evaluation, I think, is going to be critical. So like evaluating supply partners is probably going to be very critical. They need high quality, suppliers that fit within their framework of bulk and low cost. I mean, that's critical for Walmart. Okay, and then as part of that, there's a lot of other things that come into this, but probably fulfillment. And again, I'm probably spelling this wrong. Fulfillment process is probably going to be up there. Let's see. I'm going to say contract review is going to be a critical one, because it's going to be important for them to have a very streamlined contract review process, and because they want to move fast. Once they get things in order, they need to ensure that they've got the product and there's no hiccups. So for them, contract review is probably going to be pretty important. Let me just delete these as I go down here to make it a little bit easier. Okay, and then I'm going to say metrics is probably very important after that. So like making sure they've got a robust system to manage all of it, because the margins are thin, or not thin, but the margins are lower. because of their position. Okay, so they need to make sure that everything's moving as it should so that they can move the volume to hit their targets and ultimately grow. So that's going to be important. And then some of these, basically where we're at now is less important. So let's just say probably quoting, pick and ship. Okay, so at this point, you can disagree with me. Audit. Okay, so I have 2 audits on here, so that's separate, but could also be the same. So we'll generally keep it at that. And then, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down. Okay, so now we've spent time thinking through things. Now we've actually, in this video, put it down on paper and created more of an understanding, and more importantly, created a process and a document that is going to be kind of a roadmap for us going forward. So now in the next video, we're going to go ahead and start building out the data system. And that's what's going to start giving us the actual information that we can use to say, how are we doing now? And then track things going forward. How are we improving? How is the growth coming? That's the next critical step. So we'll do that in the next video. If you haven't already, head over to jasonunlock.com to get this and the playbook. And subscribe to the YouTube channel as well if you haven't already, so that you can get alerted when more videos like this come out. So when you're ready, after you've done this, go ahead, click on the next video, and we'll move on with the process.